So my name is Mar, and together with Monica, we will talk about the technical communities at an enterprise scale, and in this case, specifically for Bloomberg. So the first question to ask is, why are we presenting this? And the answer to this is that we think that technical communities are very beneficial to the companies, and well, essentially this is a pitch. So let's go over a bit of what we're going to talk about. We will start off from why creating actually these technical communities, how they are organized and they work. We will go over a bit of the history of the Python guild specifically. Yes, I'm mentioning guilds here, but I'm explaining what they are a bit later, sorry. And then we're going to talk about how the Python guild is right now, the major achievements that happened through the Python guild, and the lessons that we learned, because obviously there are things there that can help anyone who wants to start anything like that. And of course, what the future holds. So if you already know what Bloomberg is, that's fine. But if you don't, it's a financial and news company. And the main product is the Bloomberg terminal, which is pretty much that screen there has some stuff of it. But think about it as a web browser that you can have access to different web pages, which we call functions. And you can find all sorts of information on there about like financial stuff, new stuff, just messaging people, anything of that like. And here we have some impressive numbers, but the important thing that I want you to remember is that there are 20,000 employees in 167 locations, and they're around the world. And furthermore, actually, there are more than 6,500 software engineers and more than 200 technologists and data scientists devoted to machine learning. So the reason I'm pinpointing these specific things is that you can understand how a global company that has so many people quite all over the place, that can impact a little bit of how these communities are. All right, so talking about the communities and the guilds, how did they start? A few years ago, I don't even remember how long ago at this point, there started being some internal meetups, which were the basic kind of meetup. So you have someone presenting something, you have networking sessions afterwards, and that was pretty much when the Python meetup started happening as well. Now, those meetups, some meetups still exist in Bloomberg, but some of the meetups as well evolved to something more. They evolved into the guilds. And guilds are entities organizing the communities that formed around the technical subjects that those meetups were covering. So we do have a Python guild, for example. Guilds serve as communities centered on strategic technical topics of interest, and they're basically for the advancement of technology in Bloomberg. Oops, sorry. All right, so why, right? I mean, the basic thing of it is still sharing knowledge, which had been the case since the internal meetup started. And the difference here is that now that you also share code and tools, much more than just the talks that we could do before. We can set standards across the company. So you can essentially say, like, talk about best practices, agree on things that you want to advance, and actually do it in a more organized fashion. When you have a centralized place that organizes the community, that is possible. And yes, I already mentioned advancing the specific area for everyone. That's the other thing, is just that if you do something in your team, for example, even testing practices, better testing practices, it benefits the team. But then if you do it at that level, it can benefit anyone in the company. And one of the most important aspects for me is that it's from the users and for the users. So you are using something and you're thinking, oh, this tool would actually be beneficial, it would save me time. Great, you can do it. You can pitch it to the guild. You can get some help doing it and do it to a standard that's really great. Right, getting convinced. How? All right, so one of the best aspects of what I've seen in the Python guild and in the guild so far. And I think it's integral to how well they actually advance everything and do everything so well, is that there is such an active community. And people are proactive, they give feedback, they share knowledge, like thinking about how things can be better and actually make them better. And that comes into play of like hard work. So yes, this is necessary. And one of the things that should be mentioned is management buy-in, because when you have something like that, people give up some of their time that they would give to the team to working on something about the guild, which means that management need to believe that it's something good. And of course, last but not least, it's iterative reform. So like I said before, guilds started from Meetups, so they start at different levels. So you have like maybe a few people getting involved, then they mature further, you have more people being involved, bigger community, and all this needs to be taken into account in terms of how it is structured and how it is actually organized. Right, so what does someone get out of this as an individual? You grow technically, so you learn from others in the field and work on things that will be used by many others, which means that the standards are very high. You need good testing, good documentation. You need them to be able, you need someone to be able to use it without having context that much. You learn a bit about more about distributed collaboration skills. I mean, at least quite a few of us have been working remote for some time. However, that gives some skill set of async communication, but not all of it. And that's the part of, we have offices all over the place. So there is a guild, for example, that have people from Asia, Europe, and US, and they've set up two different meetings in order to accommodate the different time zones, because they're like completely opposite of each other. And then just making sure that there are shared notes, all the async communications possible, and so on. Another part of it is that you have a lot of impact while you're working on guilds, and exposure as well as recognition. So communities include many more people across the company. So imagine like in a team, you can have this much impact. In the guild, you can have like, I don't know, like a lot more. And exposure to different people as well, tools and ways of working is something amazing. Like there's always something extra to gain in terms of knowledge of how other teams work. And this gives you that opportunity. So like offhandedly, like easily to get it like that. And the other part of it is that the efforts that one is putting to the guilds are getting recognized, and they're being sent back to the management chain. Another part of it is that it actually gives you a break from the day-to-day work that you're doing. Like it could be just that you're doing something that's a little bit mundane, or at that point, because like we all know it's great to solve puzzles, but at some points you need to do also some stuff like, I don't know, move from Python 2 to Python 3. Like it's not that pleasant. Of course, there are tools to help you, and it should have definitely happened, but yeah. But the other part is that maybe you just want to do something else as well. For example, when the Python meetups had started, I was mostly writing C++, and I love Python. So yeah, that helped. And another part of it, like I mentioned before, is like you build the tools that you want to use for yourself, but also for everyone else as well. So you have something to gain out of this also, as well as everyone else, of course. Right, so you're convinced. How do you convince your company, right? So 92% of tech employees say they want more training opportunities, and 62% feel that an increase in learning opportunities would motivate them more at work. And these are stats that have like been written for in terms of the great resignation that's hitting the tech industry. And that's not a small thing. Having something else to put your efforts in, to get knowledge out of, to keep learning things is actually very important. So yeah, the company has a lot to gain out of that. But it's not simply that, it's also that you have one single point that one single organization, guild, technical community that essentially create tools that everyone else can use. So there's like the duplication is much less, obviously. And all of this, it's improving the company all over, like across the whole company, really. All right, so, you know, it's quite a magical place, but how does it actually work? So the organization of the guilds, sorry, the slide looks weird for me. I don't know if you can actually see it. Okay, so the organization of the guilds, there. One big part of it is the leaders, and the leaders are charged to influence the use of the technology internally and also engage with the technology community externally. The leaders are responsible for the success of the guild and upholding the 4 core responsibilities of the respective guild. And those I'm going to talk about in a few slides, actually. Further from the leaders, there is also a subcategory that are the chairs, and the chairs represent the guild at a more senior level, but also they organize the guild as a whole, and they're involved into a more strategic kind of thinking in terms of how the guilds operate over time, how the guild matures, what are the needs of the guild at this point. They're different depending on maturity level and everything going on around the community, of course. And some guilds have 2 co-chairs, and the reasons for that are vary. So it's, of course, it has to do with workload as well, but there's also the simple fact of the time zones difference. So for the Python guild, until now, there is 1 guild chair in Europe and 1 in the US, actually, to balance that out a bit. And of course, the thing that the community and the guild could not exist without are the members and the community itself. And that is everyone who is either passively or actively involved without having to commit, though. So what that means is like passively being involved could be just going to talks or reading the newsletters, staying involved in that manner, but actively could also be just actually contributing to a tool that you're interested in, but you don't really want to do something else necessarily, or you just wanted to do that thing. That's absolutely fine. And actually that's a win-win for everyone. All right, so the 4 pillars that I mentioned before. The first of it is the internal presentation and meetups. Now, like I've mentioned that meetups still exist, separate from the guilds also, but it's still one big part of the guilds as well. So those have to do with the internal meetups, the keynote talks, actually engaging with external speakers, education trainings internally, guild newsletters, and more. Another part of it is the engineering influence. So here we have essentially how the guild as an organization can influence the direction, the supporting the application design, actually infrastructure roadmap, giving some feedback to the infrastructure roadmap, seeing what's happening in the community and using that. Documentation for best practices or even pragmatic approaches depending on the use case and so on. On the collaborative development front, there is, of course, open sources in there, but there's the part of creating the tools to be used inside the community as well, organizing some kind of internal sprints and hackathons and things like that. Further than that, the conference engagement. I mean, part of this is like right now, but also it's identifying conferences to attend and participate in, nominate attendees, and coordinating tech talks, helping out with tech talks, giving feedback, all that can involve. All of them have quite a lot of possibilities of how someone could implement them, and it's up to the guilds on how they do that. Currently, we have 11 guilds, which is a really nice number. So there are 2 categories of guilds, and one of them can be language. So for example, we have Python, C++ guild, Java guild, But there's another thing that has to do with the subject. So you have testing, machine learning, and these do overlap. So like you hear machine learning, you definitely hear Python in there. And there's a collaboration that happens between groups in that sense. So there is, for example, for the Python Guild, there is a testing working group. So Monica will talk more about working groups afterwards. This is the connecting link between the two guilds in collaborating and making sure that both guilds are good with what's happening and work on them. We have 150 guild leaders and sirs across the offices. This is amazing. It shows really how many people have believed in this idea and want to make it better. And I love it. All right, I guess it's time to talk about my story. So once upon a time, I was born. No, I'm joking. Like I mentioned, the internal meetups started happening at some point, and my background was in Python because I was working in a company before and we were doing Python, and I had joined Bloomberg, and I was doing C++ mostly at that point, which I liked as well, don't get me wrong, but Python still my heart. Then when we were talking about internal meetups, and I thought, okay, what would I like? And I thought, you know what, it would be cool if we had some Python meetups. So I floated the idea around, and then I heard that Mario Cortera was actually starting Python meetups as well. And I just straight off went in there and said, yeah, I want to help, which thankfully they said yes. And obviously it was great. I started organizing, helping with organizing these meetups. And then the Python Guild actually came into existence. It started evolving into a guild and more people were involved. And I kept organizing the internal events at that point, which was very nice. And then along the way, the Python infrastructure team actually came to be. And that showed how much Bloomberg actually appreciated and realized how top language Python also is in Bloomberg, which is great. And while I was in the path to becoming a team lead, I actually also became a co-chair of the guild. And it had been very rewarding to actually see how the guild grew, how the maturity changed, the needs, everything that was happening in there. I really loved it. And for the last few months, I have become a co-coordinator of the guild's program overall. And a few things that are close to my heart there is inclusion for everyone, like breaking perceived barriers of entry and so on, and having more transparency about what we're doing. So the early days of the Python Guild, like I mentioned, it started off from meetups, of course. Then a smaller community existed in the beginning. So just a few people, the chair, actually there was only one chair in the beginning, if I'm not mistaken. And then the chair was essentially organizing stuff. The leaders were helping out. The infrastructure team started to exist, and the infrastructure team was by default in the guild. So they were guild leaders as well. So that the communication would stay open between the two entities and they would complement each other. Now that, as the guild grew, the infrastructure team grew, it started becoming a little bit confusing. So that's when we changed what a guild leader is, what being a guild leader means. And we said that a guild leader is someone who actually is leading a working group. And another thing that happened there was opening up all the meetings to everyone in Bloomberg who wants to join. So that has two benefits. One of them is that the communication between the infrastructure team and the guild kept flowing. And the other part of it is that there is a lot of transparency about what's going on, and you can get good input from people who want to contribute. All right, that's all for me. And I'll give it the floor to Monica to talk about what's happening in the Python Guild now.
Okay, hi. So as Ma mentioned, I'm Monica, and I'm currently a leader in the Python Guild. So I'm going to be talking a bit more about the present day of the Python Guild. So Our objective hasn't changed right from the beginning. The mission is to empower the internal Bloomberg Python community and raise Bloomberg's image as a company committed to Python. But we've come a long way in the adoption of Python at Bloomberg, as Marianna kind of alluded to. Python is used by most teams and the community has ballooned. So even teams that use C++ for efficiency tend to write some integration tests and system tests in Python. And how do we make sure that thousands of developers across different locations are able to access the information and get the assistance that they need? Or more concretely, what are we as the Python Guild doing? So firstly, we liaise. We liaise with the infrastructure team, with the DevX team, and with the training team on the roadmap for Python at Bloomberg. We bring everyone together to discuss it. We also build community. We organize events, workshops, and trainings. And with the assistance of the Python infrastructure team, we support the inner source community and inner source projects. And finally, we engage with the external Python community, aka you guys. And how do we work? So Mar mentioned working groups a few times. I'm now going to hopefully explain what those are. So they're a way of us dividing the work of the guild so that we can achieve the guild's mission. Each working group will have like a smaller, well-defined goal, and they're given a lot of autonomy to achieve that goal. That's not to say that they don't collaborate. Working groups do collaborate. They collaborate with each other and they collaborate across with different guilds as well. And so what's a working group made up of? There are some leaders, so probably one or more people who are experienced in the guild and have a bit of background. And then the members of the working group, they come from the wider Python community. So the success of each working group really relies on the momentum of its work being relevant to the different teams around the company. The life cycle of a working group is much the same as that of any team. If there's a new need or a new idea that comes up, we ask, is that something that already falls under the remit of one of the existing working groups? If it does, maybe that working group will absorb that idea. Otherwise, it might be time to start a new working group. So how do we create a working group? We get together people who are really passionate about that topic. They research and they come up with a plan. It takes a lot of initial investment as the group throws a whole bunch of ideas at the wall until they find something that finally sticks. Once they've found that thing that sticks, we move into more of the midlife of the working group. So structures are in place, the initial investment starts to pay off, and progress and enhancements are coming along, but it's a bit more incremental than in the beginning. We also want to make sure that there are regular retrospectives, so we're tracking our progress and keeping ourselves accountable. And then I guess, how do we decide when to dissolve a working group? Not every working group makes sense to live on forever. Some working groups might have a predetermined lifetime because they're particularly tied with a specific project, and then they end when that project is completed. Other working groups, they might have a goal and they're working towards it. Once they've kind of got to that 80-20, maybe it's time to reallocate those resources. It's no longer the most pressing priority, and so they move on to working on something else. And then there are also working groups that have a continued presence because they perform a role or a function that's going to be required for this foreseeable future. So like the communications working group or the conferences working group. And yeah, within the Python Guild, we have working groups in all of these different phases, every single phase of life. So now, hopefully we know what a working group is. What working groups do we have in the Python Guild at Bloomberg? And how do they help us achieve our goal? So I would split our working groups into roughly 3 broad categories. Firstly, those that improve the Python experience at Bloomberg, then those that grow knowledge and resources, and finally, those that communicate with Bloomberg and also beyond. So I'm going to start with those that improve the Python experience. We have several working groups that focus on improving the software development lifecycle, SDLC, for Bloomberg engineers. They work across a few different domains, but they share the same goals of spreading knowledge on which tool to use and how to use it, listening to and addressing community feedback, and especially the pain points, as well as writing support software to make it easier. So, for example, we have the testing working group, which collaborated with our automated testing guild to create a suite of tools to make integration testing easier. Alongside our working groups that improve the SDLC, we also have a code development working group and a design reviews working group. So the code development working group is like a platform for those who want to contribute to Python projects within Bloomberg. Is kind of run around regular meetups, which connect the contributors with the projects, and also provides an open floor for anyone working on a project or anyone who has an idea to get opinions and get advice from other people in a similar situation. So the libraries and tools that this working group build improve the lives of Python developers around the company. So it's a great way for people to be able to give back to the Python ecosystem. Not to mention that participating in this working group would grow your skills and your network, because it's an opportunity to work on really interesting projects outside of your main business area and with a variety of new people. If you're wondering what type of libraries are we writing in this working group, or what type of projects do we do? One example could be our service middleware library. So you can think of a middleware as like a Python decorator that's applied to every service request. They can be inserted into the callable chain, and they wrap the next callable, so they perform an action before and after, or multiple actions before and after it's completed. So some of the middlewares that we have are for metrics, exceptions, request, validation, and also logging. And having this code abstracted out of each service means that every different developer and every team doesn't need to write and maintain their own version of this functionality. So as I mentioned, we also have the design reviews working group. So that's a resource really for teams writing a Python library within Bloomberg for the wider consumption of the company, or for project maintainers who want to open source an existing library. So that could be a library created by the code development working group, for example. And my team actually recently called on the design reviews working group. So I work in a middleware team, and we wanted to expose a new Python interface to our middleware. So we worked with the design reviews working group to get feedback on the API. And the feedback came from someone outside of the team who was unfamiliar with our product, which made it really invaluable. Next, working groups that grow our knowledge and resources. So obviously we have training and documentation. They're right up there. And this is a collaboration with the training team. We want to ensure that all engineers across the company, irrespective of their tenure or irrespective of their team, are up to speed with the newest and the best practices related to Python and internal Python related tech. And then on the flip side, the feedback we get from the training team when they deliver these modules and when we work with them to deliver modules on the students' pain points and like what works well, what works less well, it's really invaluable to spur us on to be able to improve the APIs that we own and where appropriate to build new tools. Pragmatic recommendations. So this working group has a large task. It's trying to help the Bloomberg engineering community at large realize the full potential of Python. So they work to reach consensus on and document recommendations agreed by the community so that we can reduce the initial investment and decision paralysis that a team might have if they're adopting Python as a new language, so they've never worked with Python before. And then they also have this For Goodness Snakes series, which spotlights good features or snakes. And this is something that we post on our internal discourse with examples of the usage, links to further information, and then encourage our community to engage, ask questions, and share their experiences with the topic. Last week's Snake of the Day was on data classes, and other things that have been covered lately are type hints, f-strings, and VM, if you get the idea. PEP Talk. So this is for Python enthusiasts who want to take a deep dive. It's an opportunity to discuss and debate in lots of detail. It works exactly like a book club, but the difference is that we read and discuss a PEP rather than a book. And also when PEPs are proposed by Bloomberg Engineering, so for example, PEP 570, Python positional only parameters, they will be presented here for initial feedback. And the PEP Talk working group is actually working on their own PEP at the moment. And then finally, working groups that focus on communications. This is a bedrock to the success of the community, and indeed all of the working groups. We have 3 primary tools that we use to disseminate information and interact with the community at Bloomberg. So firstly, the newsletter. This is for everyone who writes Python or is interested in Python. It's an email subscription and it comes out every 2 weeks, providing an overview of everything Python related that's been going on. It allows us to advertise upcoming events and share high-level information on new projects and the work of the Guild. Secondly, the Python chat. So what's this? This is a chat that anyone in the department can join and ask a question or discuss something Python related. We have over 3,000 people in this chat, as well as Python experts that are available and monitoring the chat to help out. You might wonder, why would I ask a question when there's 3,000 people in this chat? Well, it's a nice place, I promise. And the short answer is that there's 3,000 other people, likelihood is that someone else has already come across your problem. And so you're going to get a quick answer that will unblock you and allow you to continue in your work. And then thirdly, the roundtable. This is a bi-weekly meeting where we discuss ongoing work, bounce around ideas, and just do some housekeeping. This is primarily geared towards active contributors in the Python ecosystem and Guild leaders. But as Mara mentioned earlier, this is open to everybody. Anyone can come along to this meeting, anyone can add an item to the agenda to be discussed. And then conferences and events. Due to the number of events we actually facilitate within the Guild these days, we've split into 2 working groups, one for internal and one for external events. But the aim for both is the same: provide Bloomberg with the best Python resources possible, make sure that the knowledge is shared from the team to the company, and from the company to the world. And they work to increase the number and the variety of speakers presenting at conferences, but also the benefits to the company coming back. We're here presenting to you. We have colleagues who are also attending the conference. And finally, the user support working group. So you may have noticed that most of the work I've mentioned in the Guild thus far has focused on people who use Python for software development. The user support working group is starting to branch out and explore how we can better support all users of Python. They're the first port of call for any Python user in Bloomberg looking for help, often acting kind of like a switchboard operator. And that brings me to a segue, which is, how did I first get involved with the Guilds? So, spoiler alert, you might have already seen on the title slide that I'm a software engineer, but forget that for a moment. When I first started attending Python Meetups run by the Guild in 2018, I wasn't a software engineer. I'd just taken an internal transfer and Python had only just become my bread and butter. But this meant that many of the topics didn't apply to me. I picked and chose which meetups to attend, and I was just getting started in the Guild. But then over time, I found that I was attending more and more of the meetups, irrespective of the topic. Even if I didn't understand half of the content, my interest was picking up. I was eager to learn more about how other people use Python to do their work. And over the course of time, the exposure to various software engineering discussions and just, all different types of Python discussions resulted in me becoming a software engineer. So once I became a software engineer, I continued attending these meetups. I began to participate in hackathons that the Python Guild did, and I also attended various training sessions. But somewhere along the way, I was discussing my experiences of writing Python in the various jobs I'd had before becoming a software engineer with others. And we wondered, why did the Python Guild offer more support for different kinds of, didn't offer more support for different kinds of Python users? And so basically, we decided that we had to be the change we wanted to see. And we started a community for Python users who weren't software developers. Around the same time, the Python Guild was also forming a user support working group. So we banded our initiatives together and we decided to, as the user support working group, encompass everything that would reach Python users irrespective of what they use Python for. And I became a leader in the user support working group about 6 months later. So back to the main story. As Mara mentioned, the Python infrastructure team has always worked very closely with the Guild, and that very much continues today, particularly on documentation and important Python initiatives which require work from the infrastructure team to facilitate. Some members of the Python infrastructure team are part of the guild leadership, but almost everyone in the team is involved to some extent. Some of the working groups, indeed, wouldn't be able to do what they do without infrastructure support. For example, the value brought in the design reviews working group comes to a huge extent from the Python infrastructure experience of designing and maintaining widely used Python APIs. And on the flip side, the guild community also has a significant input on where the infrastructure team focuses their energy. Indeed, sometimes the line between guild work and infrastructure work becomes unclear. So we've been doing this for a while. What have we achieved? Traditionally, Bloomberg's known for being mainly a C++ company, and we're seeing that that's evolved. We've gone from asking why in Python to why not in Python. Python is now a primary language for training new hires. In our job openings, there's almost double the amount mentioning Python compared with C++. And we have an active, ever-growing community, as well as an increasing number of community-owned projects. The Python infrastructure team not only exists, but has grown. And we do presentations at numerous Python conferences. We've collaborated with other guilds, in particular with the Automated Testing Guild, to completely change the way testing is done at Bloomberg. The Python community at Bloomberg now includes a few different PSF fellows. There's someone from the Python Steering Council within our community. And now as a company, we're also a visionary sponsor of the Python Software Foundation. So you see, we've achieved some things. But what have we learned along the way? Not everything's been a success, I assure you. But we think that engagement with the community is at the heart of any project being successful. So we made guilds the first port of call. Make working with the guild the easiest option. Be accessible, be welcoming, and know your audience. Once you start providing that value and people start using your tools, they'll organically want to make enhancements and add features. Make it easy for them to do so, be pragmatic, and you'll gain further traction. And once people know to go to the guild first, that information becomes centralized. And once the information is centralized, everything becomes easier. Building community can be much harder when working remotely, and it can feel more forced and less organic. Community obviously looks different in each of the fully virtual, hybrid, or fully in-person environment. But irrespective of whether we're online or in person, the professional growth that people can get from participating in the Guilds program is still massive. So be sure to reiterate that. We've tried to be really mindful about what is and isn't working as we transition from in-person events to 100% virtual and kind of everything in between. By continuing to reassess where people are at and canvas feedback, we try to meet the community where they are. So back to collaboration. Sustaining collaboration requires the culture to foster collaboration. Make it clear that collaborating, especially with someone in a different vertical, will give the project that you're working on greater exposure and a greater chance of being widely adopted. So that when beginning a project, it's a no-brainer to find a collaborator, especially try and find someone as far away from you in the org as you can. We've found that this goes beyond guild projects and extends into our day jobs, not to mention the fact that the relationships you form working with people in guilds and on guild projects often come in handy when you then kind of need help from their team because you have an outage or there's some high priority project that's come up. Secondly, don't assume that managers will be aware of guild work or the benefits of the guilds. We bring managers on board by making that information really easily accessible and offering information sessions which are specifically for managers so that the managers can then become promoters of guild participation rather than being wary of it. Nevertheless, we do all have a day job, and some projects that we work on will be more time consuming or more urgent than others. So everyone needs that right to scale their guild commitments to their availability. The last thing we want is for people to get overwhelmed, overworked, and burnt out. And then last, but maybe the most important factor, food and free stuff in general. It's one extra nudge to leave your desk and switch your context. It's small, but I'm sure you'll agree with me that it makes a difference. And everyone is happier when they're not hungry. So we've spoken a lot about our history. What does the future hold? As Python has become more widely adopted by analysts and beyond, as I mentioned, we're beginning to support Python communities outside of Bloomberg engineering, and we want to see that continue. We have a new SDLC working group focusing on improving the Python packaging experience, and Bloomberg's providing 2 years of funding to the PSF for a full-time project and community manager for the Python packaging ecosystem. Sorry, all those P's. We're hoping to open source a number of internal solutions so that the Python community outside of Bloomberg can benefit from them too. We have an ongoing collaboration with Microsoft, actually, working on making CPython faster. And you can find out more about that at github.com/fastercpython, faster-cpython, that is. And we're preparing for Python 3.11. So we're making sure that all of our widely used packages are available in 3.11 as soon as it's released, so that teams can immediately start using it and reaping the benefits. If you're wondering, we sourced all the images in this talk from one of these 3 websites. They're a great resource for finding images with the correct attribution to use in presentations. And thank you so much for joining us. We'd love to hear how technical communities function where you work, or what ideas you have for forming and growing them. Thank you.